The first time I realized I was being erased, it wasn't dramatic. No shouting, no slammed doors, no tearful confession. It was a quiet sentence said casually across my parents' kitchen island while Christmas lights blinked behind the window and my coffee went cold in my hands. "We didn't list you as a beneficiary," my mother said. "It just made more sense this way." That was it. No apology, no explanation, just logistics. My name is Natalie Grayson. I was 32 years old that December, old enough to understand exactly what was happening and young enough to still feel the shock settle somewhere deep in my chest. I didn't argue. I didn't ask why. I just nodded like someone who had been told the weather forecast. Across from me, my younger brother Lucas didn't look up from his phone. My sister Amanda smiled faintly the way she always did when something went her way without her having to ask. My father cleared his throat and said, "You're independent, Nat. You always have been." That sentence had followed me my entire life. It sounded like praise. It functioned like a justification. I wrapped my fingers around the mug and said nothing. Silence had always been my safest response in this family. If you're wondering what I had supposedly done to deserve this, the answer is simple. Nothing. I hadn't stolen. I hadn't lied. I hadn't cut contact. I showed up to birthdays, holidays, graduations. I remembered dates. I sent gifts. I made myself useful in quiet, efficient ways. But usefulness, I was learning, was not the same as value. That Christmas gathering wasn't supposed to be about legal documents. It was supposed to be about togetherness, about tradition, about pretending just for one night that our family functioned on something other than unspoken hierarchy. My parents' house sat on a quiet street outside Hartford, the same colonial I'd grown up in. Same creaky staircase, same dining room table polished to a shine that reflected the chandelier overhead. I had helped my mother cook that morning like I always did. Chopped vegetables, set plates, made myself invisible in familiar ways. Lucas arrived late, as usual, smelling faintly of cologne and entitlement. He had joined the family business 2 years earlier, stepping straight into a management role, despite having bounced between jobs before that. My father liked to say Lucas had natural leadership instincts. Amanda arrived with her fiancé Brian, her engagement ring catching the light every time she gestured. She talked about wedding venues and color palettes while my mother listened with rapt attention, already planning. No one asked how my job was going. I worked in compliance for a mid-sized insurance firm downtown. Not glamorous, not flashy, but stable. Detail-oriented, important in ways that rarely impressed anyone who hadn't needed it. After dinner, my father suggested coffee in the kitchen. That was when the conversation shifted. Papers appeared, folders, a casual tone that didn't match the weight of the words. They were restructuring the family trust. Lucas would take over operational control of the company when my father retired. Amanda would receive the house. I would receive nothing that required documentation. "You don't need it," my mother said gently. "You're doing fine on your own." I wanted to ask when doing fine became a reason to be excluded. I wanted to ask why my independence disqualified me from belonging. But years of practice kept my face neutral. I said, "Okay." Amanda glanced at me, then her eyes sharp with something unreadable. Lucas finally looked up from his phone, surprised as if he'd expected resistance. "You're cool with this?" he asked. I met his gaze. "It's your decision." That wasn't entirely true, but it was close enough. Later that night, as I drove back to my apartment through empty streets dusted with snow, the silence inside the car pressed in on me. I replayed the conversation not obsessively, but methodically. This hadn't been sudden. It had been building for years. The birthday my parents forgot because it fell the same week Lucas signed his first big client. The promotion dinner they skipped because Amanda needed help with wedding planning. The way my mother framed my choices as preferences but theirs as milestones. Love, I realized, had conditions here, and I had unknowingly violated them by becoming too self-sufficient. I didn't cry that night. I took off my coat, set my keys down, fed my cat, followed my routine with almost surgical precision. But something had shifted. A boundary I hadn't known existed had been crossed, and the silence around it was louder than any argument could have been. The next morning, I woke up with a strange clarity. Not anger, not grief. Awareness. I opened my laptop and pulled up a document I hadn't looked at in years. Notes I'd taken back when my grandmother passed away. Questions I'd asked answers half given. Patterns I'd ignored because acknowledging them would have required action. I remembered my grandmother, Eleanor Grayson, sitting beside me at that same kitchen table years earlier, telling me softly, "Watch what people do when they think you won't notice." At the time, I'd thought she meant strangers. Now I understood she meant family. I didn't know yet what I was going to do. I wasn't planning revenge. I wasn't plotting a confrontation. But I knew one thing with certainty. If they thought I would accept being quietly erased, they had misunderstood me entirely. And they were about to learn the difference between compliance and consent. For the first few days after Christmas, nothing happened. No follow-up emails. No calls asking if I had questions. No awkward attempts to soften what had been said. That silence wasn't accidental, it was strategic. My parents believed the matter was settled. Lucas had his role. Amanda had her future. And I, as always, would adjust. That assumption had shaped my entire life. I went back to work the following Monday. The office was quiet, most people still on holiday schedules. I liked that. Quiet gave me room to think without interruption. At my desk, I reviewed a routine compliance file. Numbers, clauses, footnotes, the kind of details people ignored until they became problems. I'd built my career on noticing what others dismissed as unimportant. By lunchtime, a familiar thought had taken shape. They hadn't excluded me because I was weak. They'd excluded me because they thought I wouldn't act. That distinction mattered. That afternoon, I requested a copy of my grandmother's estate documents from the county records office. Not out of spite, out of curiosity. Eleanor Grayson had died 8 years earlier, and at the time, everything had been handled quietly by my father and his attorney. I trusted that process. Trust, I was learning, was something my family used selectively. When I got home that evening, I called my Aunt Lorraine, my mother's older sister. She lived in Vermont, far from the family orbit, and had a habit of saying uncomfortable truths with a calm smile. She answered on the third ring. "You sound different," she said after I explained why I was calling. "Different how?" Awake, she replied. I told her about Christmas, about the trust, about the casual way my name had been removed from the future. She wasn't surprised. "I wondered how long it would take," she said. That stung more than I expected. "You knew?" I asked. I suspected she corrected. "Your mother likes order. Your father likes efficiency. You don't fit neatly into either." "What did Grandma want?" I asked. There was a pause. "Eleanor believed in balance," Lorraine said. "She worried your father would confuse fairness with convenience." That night, I barely slept. Not because I was upset, but because my mind was busy connecting dots I'd ignored for years. The next morning, an email appeared in my inbox. From my father. Subject: quick question. He asked if I could stop by the house later that week to sign a few documents as a witness. Routine paperwork, he said. Nothing that involved me directly. I stared at the screen for a long time. Witness? Not participant, non-beneficiary. Observer. I didn't reply right away. Instead, I forwarded the email to a lawyer whose name Lorraine had given me. Her friend from law school, now practicing estate and trust law in New Haven. His name was Samuel Porter. He responded within the hour. "Happy to review before you sign anything." That was enough. 2 days later, I sat across from Samuel in his office, the walls lined with framed degrees and old photographs. He listened without interrupting while I explained my family structure, the business, the trust, the Christmas conversation. When I finished, he folded his hands and said, "They're consolidating." I nodded. That's what it felt like. "You're not being punished," he continued. "You're being neutralized." The word landed hard. He explained how family trusts were often restructured quietly, how signatures mattered more than people realized, how being asked to witness could legitimize decisions without granting rights. "Before you sign anything," he said, "we need to know what you already own." "I don't own anything," I replied. He looked at me carefully. "Are you sure?" That question followed me home. That evening, Amanda called. Her voice was bright, almost cheerful. "Mom said you seemed fine about everything," she said. "I just wanted to check in." I waited. "I know this must be weird for you," she added, "but you've always been so self-sufficient. I'm sure you get it." I could hear Brian in the background laughing. "I get it," I said. She relaxed instantly. "Good. I knew you would." After we hung up, I opened my laptop and pulled up the county records portal again. The request for my grandmother's documents was already being processed. It wasn't anger that drove me then. It was something quieter and far more dangerous. Certainty. They had mistaken my silence for agreement. And that mistake was about to cost them more than they realized. Because once you see the structure clearly, you stop asking where you belong. You start asking who benefits from you staying where you are. And that was the question I was finally ready to answer. The envelope from the county clerk arrived on a Thursday morning, tucked between credit card offers and grocery flyers, looking far less important than it was. I didn't open it right away. I set it on the counter, poured myself coffee, fed my cat, and stood at the window, watching a delivery truck idle on the street below. I had learned over the years that rushing information gave it power. Patience took it back. When I finally slid a finger under the seal, my hands were steady. Inside were copies of my grandmother Eleanor Grayson's estate documents. Trust, summaries, amendments, attachments. Dense legal language that most people skimmed and forgot. I didn't skim. I read every line. The first thing I noticed was the date of the original trust. It had been established more than 20 years ago, long before my grandfather died, and it named all grandchildren as contingent beneficiaries. Not equally, not generously, but intentionally. Lucas, Amanda, and me. The second thing I noticed was what happened 3 years later. An amendment signed shortly after my grandmother suffered her first stroke. The language shifted. Control was centralized. Authority moved upward. But the contingent beneficiary clause wasn't removed. It was deferred. That was the word. Deferred until consolidation. I sat down slowly, the coffee untouched. Deferred didn't mean erased. It meant waiting. I called Samuel immediately. "This is interesting," he said, after I emailed him the documents. "Very interesting." He explained what I was seeing in practical terms. My parents hadn't stripped me of anything directly. They had simply reorganized things so my interest remained dormant, unless activated by a specific event. An event like liquidation, or sale, or consolidation. An event they were clearly preparing for. "They need clean paperwork," Samuel said. "They need every loose end tied, including me." That afternoon, I received another email from my father, following up on those documents. "Can you come by Saturday?" The timing was almost impressive. I didn't respond. Instead, I asked Samuel what my options were for. "You can refuse to sign," he said. "That slows them down." And then I asked, "Then they'll pressure you," he replied, "or try to buy you out quietly." I leaned back in my chair. "I don't want money," I said. He paused. "Most people say that until they see the number." I smiled faintly. I'm not most people. That evening, I met my friend Claire for dinner. She'd known me since college long enough to recognize when something fundamental had shifted. "You're calm," she said. "That worries me." "It shouldn't," I replied. "It's clarity." I told her what I'd learned carefully without dramatizing it. She listened, her fork suspended midair. "So they didn't forget you," she said slowly. "They sidelined you." "Yes. And now they need you." "Yes," she exhaled. "That's awful." "No," I corrected. "It's useful." Saturday came. I went to my parents' house on time coat, neatly folded over my arm. Expression neutral. My mother greeted me with a tight smile. My father was already seated at the dining table, papers arranged precisely in front of him. Lucas wasn't there. Neither was Amanda. That was deliberate. "We just need a few signatures," my father said, sliding the folder toward me. I didn't open it. "I've had the documents reviewed," I said calmly. My mother stiffened. "Reviewed?" "Yes," I replied, "by counsel." The room went very still. My father's eyes narrowed slightly. "Why would you do that?" "Because my name appears in the trust," I said, and I wanted to understand what I was being asked to witness. My mother laughed softly, the sound brittle. "Natalie, you're reading too much into this." "I don't think so," I replied. I opened the folder, then just enough to confirm what I already knew. Language about consolidation, about authority, about finalization. My signature would have closed the loop. "I'm not signing this," I said. My father's jaw tightened. "You're being difficult." "No," I said evenly. "I'm being accurate." My mother leaned forward. "Why are you doing this now?" I met her gaze. "Because you did." Silence. My father closed the folder. "You're jeopardizing plans you don't understand." "I understand them very well," I replied. "I work in compliance." That landed harder than I expected. "We raised you better than this," my mother said. I stood. "You raised me to notice details." I left without another word. By the time I reached my car, my phone was already buzzing. A text from Lucas. "Dad says you're causing problems. What's going on?" I typed a response. "I'm protecting my interests." He didn't reply. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city lights flickering beyond the window, and felt something unfamiliar settle in my chest. Not fear. Momentum. They thought this was about paperwork. They didn't yet understand it was about power. And once power shifts, it doesn't ask permission to move. The pressure didn't come immediately. That was the first mistake they made. They assumed shock would soften me, that confusion would lead to compliance, that a few days of silence would reset the balance the way it always had. Instead, the quiet gave me room. On Monday morning, Samuel called. "They're going to escalate," he said, "but not publicly. Not yet." I asked him how he knew. "Because people who are used to control don't rush when it slips," he replied. They try to reframe. That afternoon, my mother called. Her tone was warm, almost nostalgic. "I made your favorite soup," she said. "You should come by." I didn't ask why. "I'm busy this week," I replied. She paused. "Busy with what?" "Work," I said, "and legal consultations." That ended the call. 2 hours later, Lucas showed up at my apartment. No warning, no text. Just a knock at the door, sharp and impatient. I didn't open it right away. When I did, he stood there, with his hands in his pockets, jaw set, the same expression he wore when he was about to say something rehearsed. "You blindsided them," he said. I stepped aside to let him in, more out of curiosity than courtesy. "They didn't blindside me," I asked. He ignored that. "Dad has investors lined up. This timing matters." I leaned against the counter. "That explains the urgency." He frowned. "This isn't about money for you, so why are you doing this?" The question wasn't hostile. It was confused. "I was removed without discussion," I said. "I'm responding." He scoffed. "You've always been dramatic." I smiled faintly. "And you've always benefited from that narrative." His eyes flicked away. "You don't even want the business," he said. "That's irrelevant," I replied. "I want choice." He shook his head. "You're risking everything over principle." "No," I said. "You're risking everything because you assumed I wouldn't notice." He stared at me for a long moment, then exhaled sharply. "They're talking about offering you a payout," he said. I didn't react. "A generous one," he added. "Clean break. You walk away." There it was. "How generous?" I asked. He hesitated, then named a number. It was more than I made in a year, less than my share would have been worth over time. I nodded slowly, and in exchange, "You sign," he said, "and stop interfering." I met his eyes. "Interfering with what?" "With plans," he snapped. "Plans that exclude me," I said calmly. He stood abruptly. "You're being unreasonable." "No," I replied. "I'm being included for the first time." He left without another word. The next day, Samuel forwarded me a formal letter. An offer. Professional, polite, framed as a resolution. I read it twice, then set it aside. What they were offering wasn't compensation. It was silence. That evening, I took a walk through my neighborhood, the air sharp with early winter. I thought about all of the times I'd accepted less because arguing felt exhausting. All the moments I'd swallowed questions because keeping peace seemed more important. Peace, I realized, had been a one-way transaction. The following morning, I sent a single email. "I am not interested in a buyout. All further communication should go through my attorney." I CC'd everyone. My parents, Lucas, Amanda. Within minutes, my phone lit up. I turned it off. At work, I buried myself in a regulatory review, letting the familiar structure steady me. Compliance was about one thing above all else: accountability. By the end of the day, Samuel called in. "Altakaan. They've hired outside counsel," he said. I closed my eyes briefly, expected. "They're preparing for a formal dispute," he continued, "which means they believe you have leverage." That word again. Leverage wasn't power. It was proof. Proof that my presence mattered enough to complicate their future. That night, Amanda finally texted. "Why are you doing this to us?" I stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I'm not doing this to you. I'm doing it for me." She replied immediately. "You're tearing the family apart." I typed, then deleted, then typed again. "No, I'm stepping out of the role that held it together at my expense." She didn't respond. I went to bed feeling strangely calm, because something fundamental had shifted. They were no longer deciding whether I belonged. They were reacting to the fact that I already did. And the next move wouldn't be emotional. It would be structural. That's when things get irreversible. Once lawyers enter the room, families stop pretending. The tone changes first. Less emotion, fewer personal appeals. Everything becomes language on paper, measured in careful design to leave no fingerprints. That was how I knew this had crossed a line they hadn't expected to cross with me. Samuel called early that morning. "They're requesting mediation," he said. "Confidential. Neutral, third party." I wasn't surprised. Mediation sounded reasonable. Civil, controlled. It was also a way to contain damage. "Do we go?" I asked. "Yes," he said without hesitation. "Not to compromise. To observe." That word again. Observe. The mediation was scheduled for the following week, held in a quiet office park outside New Haven. No windows, beige walls. A long table meant to keep everyone seated and polite. My parents arrived together. My father looked tense but composed. My mother's face carried the practiced softness she used when she wanted sympathy without accountability. Lucas arrived alone, already on his phone. Amanda joined by video, sitting somewhere bright and airy, likely in her apartment engagement ring on full display. The mediator, a woman named Karen Holt, explained the process. No accusations, no raised voices. Focus on resolution. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my hands folded in my lap. I was excluded from the trust without discussion, I said. I was then asked to legitimize that exclusion by signing documents. I declined. I'm here to understand my position and protect it. Karen nodded and turned to my parents. My father cleared his throat. Natalie has always been independent. We didn't think she wanted involvement. That's an assumption, Karen said calmly, not consent. My mother leaned forward. We didn't mean to hurt her. I looked at Karen. Intent doesn't change impact. Amanda scoffed on the screen. This is all so dramatic. I didn't look at her. Lucas finally spoke. What do you actually want? I met his eyes. Transparency, recognition, and time. Silence filled the room. Karen raised an eyebrow. That's reasonable. My father stiffened. Time costs money. Yes, I replied. That's why you're here. The meeting ended without resolution. But something important happened in that room. For the first time, my silence wasn't mistaken for agreement. It was understood as restraint. Afterward, Samuel and I debriefed in his car. They didn't deny your interest, he said. They tried to minimize it. That means it exists, I replied. He smiled. Exactly. The following days were a slow burn. Emails flew between attorneys, requests for documentation, deadlines extended, meetings postponed, plans stalled. At work, I received news that would have once thrilled me. A promotion, a significant one. More responsibility, more visibility. I accepted without hesitation. That decision mattered more than I realized at the time. Because independence isn't just emotional, it's financial, structural, legal. Amanda called that night. Her voice was sharp. Mom's a mess. I waited. She says you've changed, Amanda continued. That you're cold. I'm clear, I said. That's the same thing she snapped. No, I replied. Cold is distance, clarity is boundary. She laughed bitterly. You think this makes you powerful? I think it makes me honest, I said. She hung up. The next escalation came quietly. A letter from the family's corporate attorney requesting my acknowledgement of a revised timeline. Samuel read it once and handed it back. They're delaying, he said, because they can't move without you. That night I went through old boxes in my closet, not out of nostalgia, out of curiosity. I found birthday cards my parents had signed together, but written entirely in my mother's handwriting. Photos where I stood just outside the center frame. Programs from events where my name appeared last, if at all. Patterns. Not cruelty, control. The realization didn't hurt the way betrayal does. It clarified. The next morning, I made a decision that surprised even Samuel. I want to retain my interest, I said. Not sell, not negotiate out. He paused. That will force oversight. I know, I replied. That's the point. He nodded slowly. Once you do that, there's no quiet exit. I'm not looking for one, I said. We filed the notice that afternoon. It wasn't dramatic, just paperwork. But that single action shifted the entire structure. By evening, my phone buzzed with messages I didn't read. By night, the family business had a problem it couldn't buy off. Me. And for the first time in my life, being the problem felt like freedom. The moment I retained my interest, the language changed. Not the words, the tone. Emails that once felt casual became precise. Polite phrases tightened into legal positioning. Timestamps mattered. Attachments multiplied. Everyone started documenting everything. That's how you know something real has shifted. Samuel warned me it would happen. When people can't move you quietly, he said they try to box you in procedurally. I wasn't afraid of procedure. Procedure was my terrain. The first real consequence landed 3 days later. A notice from the family company's council informing all stakeholders that due to unresolved governance, matters certain expansion initiatives would be paused pending internal review. Lucas called me within the hour. This is on you, he said, skipping any greeting. No, I replied. This is on assumptions. He exhaled sharply. Do you have any idea how bad this looks? I do, I said calmly. That's why I didn't create it. Silence. Then quieter, Dad's furious. I'm sure, I replied. That night, my mother sent a long email. Not forwarded through council. Not CC'd to anyone. Just her. She wrote about family history. About sacrifices. About how my father had worked tirelessly to build stability for us. How Lucas carried the burden of expectation. How Amanda needed support as she planned her wedding. And how I had always been strong enough to stand alone. That line again. I read the email twice, then I closed it without replying. Strength in this family had always been code for expendable. The following week, Samuel called me into his office. They've requested a formal accounting, he said. They want to examine whether your retained interest creates fiduciary complications. That sounds serious, I said. It sounds strategic, he corrected. They're hoping to make this feel risky. I nodded. Is it? No, he said, but it's inconvenient for them. Good. At the same time, something else was happening quietly. People at work started treating me differently. Not with suspicion, with respect. My new role came with authority I hadn't realized I'd been ready for. I made decisions without second-guessing myself. I spoke plainly in meetings. I didn't soften my words to make others comfortable. No one pushed back. That surprised me more than anything my family did. It made something painfully clear. I hadn't been quiet because I lacked confidence. I'd been quiet because I was trained to be. The next family gathering I skipped was Easter. No explanation, no excuse. Amanda sent a group text with a photo of the table set, pastel plates, and flowers arranged just so. Missing you today, she wrote. I didn't respond. Later that evening, Lucas texted me separately. Dad's talking about stepping back, temporarily. That was new. I stared at the message for a long moment. Stepping back wasn't humility. It was retreat. I replied with one sentence. I hope he takes care of himself. Lucas didn't respond. The formal accounting request came back clean. No irregularities, no exposure, no leverage against me. Samuel smiled when he told me. They were hoping you'd flinch, he said. I didn't, I replied. No, he agreed. You didn't. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, the city humming softly outside. I thought about my grandmother again, about the way she'd watched quietly, rarely intervening, always observing. I wondered if she'd known this moment would come, if she'd left that deferred clause not as a gift, but as a test, not of entitlement, of resolve. The next morning, I received a calendar invite. Board observation session, mandatory. I hadn't asked for it. I hadn't pushed for it. They needed me present. That was the shift. At the meeting, I said very little. I listened, took notes, asked one question near the end about compliance oversight tied to future sales. The room went quiet. The attorney cleared his throat. Daniel avoided my eyes. I didn't press. I didn't need to. Afterward, a woman from finance pulled me aside. I'm glad you're here, she said quietly. Things make more sense when you ask questions. I thanked her and walked out into the afternoon light, feeling something settle into place. Not triumph, alignment. That evening, my mother called again. This time I answered. We didn't think you'd go this far, she said. I didn't think you'd go that far either, I replied. She paused. What do you want from us now? I considered the question. I want space, I said. An acknowledgement that I get to choose. Her voice wavered. You're pushing us away. No, I said gently. I'm stepping back. We ended the call quietly. No resolution, no forgiveness. Just distance that felt intentional instead of imposed. As I set my phone down, I understood something that would have frightened me once. I no longer needed their approval to feel whole. And that meant the next phase wouldn't be about defense. It would be about consequence. The kind that unfolds slowly, publicly, and without emotion. The kind that can't be undone. The consequences didn't arrive as punishment. They arrived as math. Once my retained interest triggered oversight, every decision my family had made quietly for years now required explanation. Not justification, explanation. The difference mattered. Daniel felt it first. At the next board observation session, he came in tense shoulders, tight voice clipped. He spoke faster than usual, as if speed could replace certainty. When questions came, he answered them competently, but without the ease he once had. Control had been his inheritance. Accountability was new. My father didn't attend that meeting. He sent a note instead citing health and strategic distance. The language was vague, carefully neutral, but the absence spoke louder than his presence ever had. The myth of him as the unchallenged center was gone. At work, I noticed my own posture change. Not physically, internally. I stopped bracing for disappointment, stopped anticipating dismissal. The energy I'd spent managing reactions was suddenly available for action. That's when my supervisor asked me to lead a cross-department audit. A real one, sensitive, high visibility. I accepted without hesitation. The irony wasn't lost on me. At home, silence became the norm. No text from Amanda. No calls from sis, no calls from my parents. Lucas limited communication to brief factual updates routed through counsel. I wasn't being frozen out. I was being recalculated. That became clear when Samuel called one afternoon with a subtle shift in his voice. They're preparing an internal vote, he said. Governance restructure. Which means I asked. They're deciding how much authority Daniel keeps, he replied, and how much oversight becomes permanent. I closed my eyes briefly. This was no longer about me. This was about what happens when favoritism collides with documentation. That evening, Amanda finally called. Her voice sounded tired, stripped of performance. "I didn't think it would get this bad," she said. I didn't respond right away. "Brian's parents keep asking questions," she continued. "About the business, about your role." I could picture her pacing phone pressed tight to her ear, the loss of narrative control unsettling her more than the situation itself. "This isn't my doing," I said calmly. "It's the structure you benefited from." She sighed sharply. "You've always had to complicate things." "No," I replied. "I've always noticed them." She went quiet. "Are you coming to the wedding?" she asked suddenly. The question wasn't an invitation. It was a test. "I haven't decided," I said truthfully. Her voice hardened. "Mom says if you don't come, it will break her heart." I exhaled slowly. Mom's heart isn't my responsibility. That ended the call. 2 weeks later, the vote happened. I wasn't in the room. I didn't need to be. Samuel called me afterward. "Daniel's authority has been reduced," he said. "Not eliminated, but shared." "And my father?" I asked. "He abstained," Samuel replied. "Formally." That single word explained everything. Abstaining wasn't neutrality. It was retreat without admission. The following day, a short article appeared in a regional business journal. Nothing scandalous. Just a mention of internal governance changes and enhanced compliance protocols. No names, no drama. But people noticed. At work, a colleague forwarded it to me with a simple note. "Saw this. Thought of you." I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Not because I was proud, because I was finally visible without having to announce myself. That night, I sat on my balcony, the city lights blinking steadily in the distance. I thought about my childhood home, the kitchen island where my exclusion had been explained so casually. I realized something then. They hadn't underestimated my emotions. They'd underestimated my patience. Patience is dangerous when paired with information. The next message came from my mother. "Can we talk, just us?" I didn't respond right away. Not because I was avoiding her, because I was deciding whether the conversation served my life, now not the version of me she preferred. Eventually, I replied, "Not tonight." That boundary was small, but it was final. The wedding was 3 months away. The business was recalibrating. My family was adjusting to a version of me they could no longer manage. And for the first time, the power dynamic wasn't shifting through confrontation. It was shifting through consequence. Quietly, irreversibly. The next chapter wouldn't be about conflict. It would be about fallout, the kind that settles long after the noise fades. Fall arrived without ceremony. Leaves turned, mornings sharpened. The city settled into a rhythm that felt steadier than summer ever did. I noticed it because my own life had finally slowed enough to let seasons matter again. The fallout wasn't loud. It was logistical. The company's governance changes rippled outward in ways my family hadn't anticipated. Lenders requested updated disclosures. Vendors asked for revised points of contact. A consulting firm was brought in to formalize compliance protocols that had previously lived in my father's head. Daniel had to explain things he'd never been asked to explain before. Not because anyone distrusted him, because trust once formalized requires structure. He called me one evening, his voice flatter than usual. "They want you on the oversight committee," he said. I paused. "As an observer." "No," he replied. "As a voting member." The words hung between us. "I'll consider it," I said. "You don't have to do this," he added quickly. "You've already made your point." "That's not why I'm here," I replied. "I'll let you know." I didn't say yes that night. I took my time. At work, my audit team uncovered a compliance gap unrelated to my family. A quiet one. The kind that grows in systems where assumptions replace review. I flagged it, documented it, and escalated it without apology. My supervisor thanked me publicly. "You saved us a lot of trouble," he said. I nodded, thinking how often I'd done the same thing at home without acknowledgement. The difference now was that my work existed in a system that rewarded clarity instead of punishing it. That realization changed me more than any legal maneuver ever could. The following Sunday, my mother showed up at my apartment. No call, no warning. I stood in the doorway, hands still on the knob, surprised by how little my body reacted. "I was nearby," she said. That wasn't true, but it wasn't worth correcting. I stepped aside and let her in. She looked around, taking in the space. Smaller than my parents' house. Cleaner, quieter. "It suits you," she said softly. I nodded. We sat at the kitchen table, the same position she'd once occupied so comfortably at home. "I don't know how to talk to you anymore," she admitted. "That's because you're not directing," I replied. She winced but didn't argue. "I thought keeping things simple would protect us," she said. I didn't think about who it would hurt. I met her eyes. You thought about who it would inconvenience. She looked down at her hands. Lucas is struggling, she said. I know, I replied. Amanda is angry, she added. I know. She looked up then, frustration edging into her voice. Don't you care? I considered the question carefully. I care about what's real, I said, not what's comfortable. She sat back, absorbing that. After a moment, she said, Your grandmother would have approved of you. That landed unexpectedly. I didn't thank her. I didn't dismiss it either. I know, I said. When she left, she hugged me lightly at the door. It felt tentative, like something being relearned. That night, I emailed Daniel. I'll join the committee, on the record. His reply came an hour later. Thank you. 2 words, no qualifiers. The first meeting was uneventful by design. Reports, metrics, risk assessments. I listened more than I spoke. When I did speak, it was measured. Afterward, the external consultant approached me. You see patterns quickly, she said. That's rare. I smiled faintly. I've had practice. The wedding invitation arrived the following week. Heavy paper, cream-colored envelope. My name printed carefully as if precision could replace intimacy. I set it on the counter and didn't open it for 2 days. When I finally did, the RSVP card felt heavier than it should have. I marked yes. Not for Amanda. Not for my parents. For myself. I wanted to see who I was in that room now without shrinking or smoothing edges. The day I mailed the RSVP, Samuel called. They've accepted the new structure, he said. No more pushback. So it's done, I replied. It's stable, he corrected. Stability, not victory. That distinction mattered. Later that evening, I stood at my window, watching the city glow, thinking about how quietly everything had shifted. No shouting, no ultimatums, just the slow exposure of a truth my family had worked hard to avoid. Love that requires erasure is not love. It's management. And once you stop cooperating, the system has to change. The wedding was 6 weeks away. The committee work was just beginning. And for the first time, I wasn't bracing for impact. I was choosing my position. The next chapter wouldn't be about reconciliation. It would be about presence. And whether anyone could meet me there, presence is a strange thing. People think it means showing up, sitting in the room, being visible. I learned it actually means something harder, not disappearing when the air gets tight. The weeks leading up to Amanda's wedding moved quickly. Final fittings, seating charts, last-minute changes that somehow became everyone else's emergency. I was included in group emails, now my name added carefully to the threads that had once excluded it. No one acknowledged the change. They just adjusted around it like furniture shifted to accommodate a new weight in the room. At the company, my role on the oversight committee settled into a rhythm. Meetings were structured, decisions documented, disagreements handled without theatrics. Daniel was professional, distant but respectful. We didn't revisit the past. We didn't need to. One afternoon, after a long meeting, he walked with me to the elevator. You're good at this, he said, not looking at me. I know, I replied. He nodded once. I should have said that earlier. I didn't respond, not because I wanted to punish him, because acknowledgement doesn't always require conversation. At home, my mother texted occasionally, neutral updates, questions about logistics. She avoided anything emotional as if afraid to misstep. That restraint was new, and oddly, it made our communication more honest. The night before the wedding rehearsal, I arrived at the venue early. A restored mansion outside the city, all white columns and manicured lawns. The kind of place chosen to project permanence. Amanda stood near the entrance, clipboard in hand, issuing instructions. When she saw me, her expression flickered. Hi, she said. Hi, I replied. An awkward pause followed. I'm glad you came, she said finally. I said I would, I replied. She studied my face. You look different. I smiled faintly. I am. She didn't ask what I meant. During the rehearsal dinner, I sat at a table near the edge of the room. Not hidden, not centered. Exactly where I wanted to be. People approached me cautiously, extended family members who hadn't spoken to me in years, friends of my parents who suddenly remembered my name. They asked polite questions, offered careful compliments. I answered calmly, without oversharing. My father avoided me all evening. That didn't surprise me. What did surprise me was the moment my mother came to sit beside me, halfway through dinner. She didn't speak at first. Then she said quietly, I didn't know how much space you were carrying. I looked at her. Neither did I. She nodded. I thought if I held things together tightly enough, nothing would fall apart. And did it? I asked. She didn't answer. The wedding itself was beautiful. Amanda looked radiant. The vows were sincere. The room filled with applause at all the right moments. I clapped with everyone else. I felt no bitterness, just distance that felt earned. At the reception, Daniel raised a glass to toast his sister. He spoke about family, about loyalty, about standing together. His eyes flicked to mine, briefly unreadable. I raised my glass when everyone else did. Not in agreement, in acknowledgement. Later that night, as the band played and people danced, my grandmother's ring sat heavy in my purse. I hadn't worn it. I hadn't needed to. Its meaning wasn't in display. It was in continuity. On Monday morning, life resumed. At work, a new project landed on my desk. High stakes, high trust. At the company, the committee scheduled its next quarterly review. No drama, no urgency, just process. And that was when the final shift occurred. An email from my father. Subject, coffee. One word, a question mark. No apology, no explanation. I stared at the screen longer than necessary. Then I typed back. Sure. We met at a cafe halfway between our houses. Neutral ground. Public, safe. He looked older than I remembered. Not frail, just smaller. As if the role he'd worn for decades no longer fit. I didn't expect this, he said, staring into his cup. I know, I replied. He hesitated. I thought giving you freedom was kindness. Freedom without choice isn't freedom, I said gently. He nodded. Your grandmother used to say that. We sat in silence for a moment. I'm stepping away for good, he said finally. From the business. I didn't react. Daniel had already told me it was coming. I wanted you to hear it from me, he added. Thank you, I said. He looked at me then. Really looked. You're not the daughter I planned for, he said. I waited. You're the one I should have listened to, he finished. I held his gaze. That's not something I need you to fix. He nodded slowly. When we parted, there was no hug, no promise to do better. Just an understanding that some doors don't close. They change shape. As I walked back to my car, I felt something settle into place. Not reconciliation. Completion. The system that had defined my role no longer existed. Not because I destroyed it, but because I stopped sustaining it. The next chapter wouldn't be about family. It would be about legacy. Not the one you inherit, the one you choose to leave. Legacy used to sound abstract to me. Something reserved for people with buildings named after them, or families large enough to require portraits. I'd assumed it was a word people used when they wanted their choices to feel permanent. I was wrong. Legacy is what remains when you stop performing. After my conversation with my father, I didn't feel relief. I felt recalibration, like something heavy had been set down, and my body was adjusting to the absence of strain. The company entered a quieter phase, not calmer, quieter. Without my father's shadow hovering over every decision, processes slowed in a healthy way. Meetings took longer. Questions were asked instead of assumed. Daniel struggled at first with the shift, but I watched him grow into it. Not gracefully, but honestly. He called me one afternoon after a difficult board session. I'm not used to this level of scrutiny, he said. It's not scrutiny, I replied. It's clarity. He exhaled. I know, I just didn't realize how much Dad shielded me. That wasn't protection, I said. It was insulation. He was quiet for a moment. You always saw it? I was trained to, I said, just not rewarded for it. That conversation changed something between us. Not intimacy, respect. And that was enough. At work, my audit project wrapped successfully. The compliance gap I'd flagged was resolved without fallout, and senior leadership took notice. I was invited into rooms I'd never been invited into before. Not as a courtesy, as a necessity. One evening, my supervisor stopped me as I was leaving. You don't seek attention, he said, but you influence outcomes. I smiled. That's the job. It should be, he agreed. I thought about my family on the drive home. How influence there had always been informal, unspoken, unevenly distributed. How outcomes were predetermined by birth order and temperament rather than contribution. No wonder I'd never felt at ease inside it. My mother and I began meeting for lunch once a month. No agenda, no repair attempts. Just two women learning how to exist without a hierarchy between us. She didn't offer advice anymore. She asked questions, sometimes awkward ones. Do you regret not taking the payout? She asked one afternoon. No, I replied without hesitation. She nodded. Your father thinks about that a lot. That's his work, I said. She smiled faintly. You sound like Eleanor. That stopped me. I didn't appreciate her enough when she was alive, my mother added quietly. I looked out the window. She knew. The holidays came and went without incident. I spent Thanksgiving with friends, Christmas quietly at home. I sent gifts to my parents, attended nothing obligatory. No one protested. That absence of conflict told me more than any apology ever could. The real test came in early spring. The company received a serious acquisition offer. Not a sale, a merger. Strategic, complex. The kind of deal my father would have controlled completely. This time it went through the committee. Through me. Daniel called me into his office the day the proposal arrived. "I want you involved from the beginning," he said. "Not as a formality." "Then I'll ask real questions," I replied. "That's why I asked," he said. "We worked late for weeks, reviewing terms, stress testing assumptions, examining governance implications that would outlive any of us." At one point, Daniel looked up from a document and said, "You're protecting something bigger than your share." "I always was," I replied. He nodded slowly. "I just didn't see it." The deal went through with amendments. Better ones. More equitable ones. On the day it closed, the board thanked the committee for its diligence. No one singled me out. That didn't matter. What mattered was the structure we'd built would remain long after the personalities involved were gone. That was legacy. Not inheritance. Not recognition. Continuity without control. That night, I took the grandmother's ring out of my drawer for the first time. I turned it over in my hand, feeling its weight. Not heavy. Grounded. I slid it onto my finger. Not because it completed me. Because it marked me. Marked the end of a cycle that began long before I had language for it. Marked the moment I stopped confusing endurance with loyalty. Later, as I stood at my window, city lights stretching endlessly beyond, I realized something quietly profound. I wasn't free because I'd won. I was free because I'd stopped playing a game designed to keep me small. The final chapter wouldn't be about triumph. It would be about what happens after you choose yourself and keep choosing, even when no one is watching, especially then. The strange thing about choosing yourself is how ordinary life becomes afterward. Not easier, not lighter, just quieter in the places that used to ache. Spring moved forward without asking my permission. The river thawed. Sidewalk cafes returned. People complained about pollen and parking like the world had always worked this way. I noticed it because I finally had the attention to spare. The merger settled into implementation. Committees dissolved into teams, teams into processes. My role became less visible and more structural, which suited me. I was no longer the outlier voice asking inconvenient questions. The questions had been built into the system. That was the point. Daniel stopped calling late at night. When we spoke, it was scheduled, focused, professional. We disagreed occasionally, but the disagreements didn't linger. There was no subtext to manage anymore. One afternoon, after a particularly dense review session, he leaned back in his chair and said, "You know, Dad never would have let this pass." I didn't ask which part. "And that's good," he added after a beat. I nodded. "It is." At work, something similar happened. A younger colleague, Jenna, asked if I'd review a report she was nervous about submitting. She hovered in my doorway, unsure eyes searching my face for a cue. "Why are you nervous?" I asked. She hesitated. "Because if it's wrong, I don't want to look difficult." I recognized the word immediately. "Difficult to who?" I asked. She blinked. "I guess, everyone." I smiled gently. "Accuracy isn't difficult. It's inconvenient. There's a difference." She laughed relief, loosening her shoulders. "You always make it sound simple." "It is simple," I said. "It's just not easy." She left my office, standing a little taller. I watched her go and felt something settle. Not pride. Continuity. My mother called less often. When she did, the conversations were brief and factual, sometimes warm, sometimes awkward, always honest. One evening, she mentioned in passing that my father had started seeing a therapist. "That's good," I said, surprised. "He says he's learning how to sit with uncertainty," she replied. I thought of the man who once ran our family like a well-oiled machine, every variable controlled, every outcome predicted. "I hope it helps him," I said. "So do I," she replied. She didn't ask me to visit. I didn't offer. Respect. I was learning often looks like space. Amanda sent a message in late April. Not a text, an email. Long, careful, apologetic without being explicit. She wrote about wedding stress, about pressure, about how she'd always felt measured against me in ways she didn't understand at the time, how she'd mistaken attention for security. I read it twice. Then I closed it. I didn't respond right away. When I did, it was brief. "I'm glad you're reflecting. I wish you well." She replied with a single sentence. "I hope one day we can talk." I didn't answer that one. Not because I was angry. Because hope without change is just another way of postponing responsibility. That summer I took a week off and went north alone. A small town near the coast. No itinerary, no agenda. Just long walks, quiet meals, early mornings. On the third day, I sat on a bench overlooking the water and realized something that startled me. I wasn't replaying conversations. Not with my parents, not with Daniel, not with Amanda. The mental loops had stopped. That absence felt like freedom. On my last night there, I wrote in my notebook something I hadn't done consistently in years. I wrote about Eleanor, about the way she'd watched quietly, about the way she'd never intervened directly, but always left doors unlocked. I understood now that her gift hadn't been the trust clause. It had been permission. Permission to wait until I was ready to step forward without asking. When I returned home, Samuel called with a small update. One final administrative matter related to the merger. "It's done," he said, cleanly. "Thank you," I replied. He hesitated. "You handled this differently than most people would." "How so?" I asked. "You didn't try to win," he said. "You tried to stabilize." "That's what lasts," I replied. After we hung up, I stood at the window again, city lights familiar now in a way they hadn't been before. I thought about how close I'd come to taking the payout, to walking away quietly, to accepting silence as peace. I thought about how tempting it had been to disappear, and how costly that would have been. The next morning, I received a message from Jenna. "Report approved. Thank you for pushing me." I smiled and typed back. "You did the work. I just asked the questions." That felt like a fitting summary of everything that had happened. I hadn't destroyed anything. I hadn't exposed the secrets. I'd simply asked questions the system wasn't designed to answer comfortably. And in doing so, I'd forced it to evolve. The final chapter wouldn't be about looking back. It would be about carrying forward what I'd learned. Quietly, intentionally, without asking for permission. The last decision I made wasn't dramatic. There was no document to sign, no meeting to attend, no call that changed the course of anyone else's life overnight. It happened on a Tuesday morning while I stood in my kitchen barefoot, watching steam rise from a mug of coffee I'd already forgotten to drink. My phone buzzed with a notification from my mother. "Your father's birthday is next weekend. We're doing a small dinner. Daniel will be there. Amanda too. It would mean a lot if you came." I didn't feel a spike of anxiety. I didn't feel guilt. What I felt was space. Enough space to ask myself a question I'd never been allowed to ask before. Do I want to be there? Not will they be hurt if I'm not? Not what does a good daughter do? Not how do I keep things smooth? Just the question itself. I let it sit. I pictured the table, the careful conversation, the way my presence would be read as reconciliation, forgiveness, a return to form. I imagined how easily my boundaries would be mistaken for availability again. And I knew my answer. I typed slowly. "I hope you have a nice evening. I won't be able to attend. I'm doing well, and I hope you are too." I pressed send and set the phone face down on the counter. That was it. No follow-up explanation, no apology, no counter-offer. The quiet afterward felt earned. Life didn't transform because of that choice. The world didn't rearrange itself in response. Work continued. Meetings happened. Emails stacked up. Groceries needed buying. But something fundamental stayed different. I no longer explained my absence. I no longer softened my clarity. I no longer negotiated my worth. The company continued to operate under the new structure. Stable, transparent, boring in the best way. Daniel adjusted. The system held. I attended meetings when needed and stepped back when not. My presence was functional, not symbolic. At work, I was offered a new role, one that came with authority but also autonomy. I accepted after reviewing the terms, carefully asking questions no one seemed bothered by anymore. That alone told me how far I'd come. I moved apartments that summer. Not out of necessity, but preference. Smaller, brighter, closer to the water. I donated furniture I'd kept out of obligation. Threw away paperwork that no longer applied to my life. Letting go became easier once I stopped waiting for permission. One evening while unpacking, I found my grandmother's ring again. It had slipped into a side pocket of my bag. I turned it over in my hand, the metal warm from the sunlit room. I didn't think about inheritance anymore. I thought about continuity, about how control had passed through generations disguised as care, about how silence had been mistaken for loyalty, about how often love was confused with access. I slipped the ring on my finger, not as a symbol of belonging, but as a reminder. I choose where I stand. Weeks later, Amanda sent a final message. "Mom worries about you." I stared at it for a moment, then replied, "I'm not lost." She didn't respond. And that was okay, because some relationships don't end in confrontation. They end in clarity, and clarity doesn't need agreement to be real. If you're listening to this and you recognize yourself somewhere in my story, I want you to hear this without embellishment or comfort language. Being excluded hurts. Being controlled hurts more. But staying in a system that only works when you stay small costs you something you never get back. You don't owe silence to people who benefit from it. You don't owe access to people who confuse love with leverage. You don't owe explanations to anyone who never listened. Revenge doesn't have to be loud. Karma doesn't always arrive with spectacle. Sometimes the tables turn simply because you stand up and stop holding them steady for everyone else. If this story resonated with you, if you've ever faced family drama, betrayal, favoritism, or been quietly excluded from what you helped build, share your experience. Leave a comment, like the video. Subscribe if you want more stories about revenge, boundaries, inheritance, and the quiet power of choosing yourself. Some endings aren't explosive. They're deliberate. And once you choose yourself, they can't be undone.